So, okay. Can we start?
Please.
So, hello, dear teachers. Good afternoon. And it is great to see you all here. It is a special day because we have a special guest who is speaking from São Paulo. Are you in São Paulo, Paulo?
Yes, I'm in São Paulo.
Is it cold there?
It's hard to say. It was very cold in the morning. Then it was about 30 around lunchtime. So it's the weather is a bit schizophrenic today, I think.
Okay. Well, it's quite hot here. Thank you, Paulo, for being here with our
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. We've got around 20 teachers and there are more joining us. Let me tell you, teachers, a little bit about Paulo. Paulo is a managing partner at Troika, an educational project startup. He has been involved in English language teaching for 14 years as a teacher educator, course designer, materials writer, and coursebook editor. In the last few years, Paulo has explored ways in which technology and innovation impact teaching and learning. And he has developed applications, platforms, and other digital products for language learning and teacher education. This is fantastic. You're really into technology. As an e-learning specialist, he has served as international expert panelist for the Horizon Report Higher Education, and then in several places. You've got the ESOL Delta, and you're currently undergoing your MA in Professional Development from the University of Chichester in the UK, right?
That's right, yes.
Paulo, first of all, what is STEAM?
Well, STEAM stands for science, technology, engineering, and maths, right? And I think it's, I'm going to mention this later on, but STEAM's been around for quite some time. We tend to see it as something that is quite innovative, but as a matter of fact, it's not exactly that innovative. The whole story begins in around the 90s for a market reason, as a matter of fact. But I really like, I'm really into history, Zaida. And I'm going to begin with a bit of a history lesson, right?
Okay, that's
so I think when we go back to the beginning of schooling, right? We had this big shift in how people were educated, because until the 19th century, there was very little reason for people to learn how to read and write, for example. There were very few practical abilities that people needed to live, right? Because most people were living in the countryside and they were, I mean, their lives revolved around farming. But with the Industrial Revolution in England, especially in the late 19th century, we had a whole range of services that were surrounding the Industrial Revolution. And then we began having offices and banks and railways and all sorts of things that they were created to serve the Industrial Revolution. And therefore, we needed skilled labor, right? Because you can't, if you don't know how to read and write, if you can't type a typewriter, you're not really that useful to the market, right? And as much as we might not believe, but the market, the way the market demands things, ends up influencing how education is shaped at large, right? And then there was this huge demand at the beginning of the 20th century for skilled labor in big cities. And therefore, governments started reshaping education so that skilled labor was provided. But then if we go back and we consider how offices worked in the beginning of the 20th century. That's, can you see my screen just for?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
I always check. I was sharing with
We
other
can
students
see
the other day.
you.
I was delivering this webinar and I wasn't sharing my screen and people were like, that's a bit confusing.
We can see you well.
Good, good. So that's exactly what an office looked like at the beginning of the 20th century, right? So we had this setup in which you had people sitting at desks doing a lot of manual labor. And that was very, yes?
You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Okay.
Were you doing any screen sharing?
I was doing, and I was just showing a photograph. So that's fine.
This is why you kept talking about what an office looked like. Da-da-da.
That's what an office looks like. Yeah.
Okay.
I was sharing and then stopped sharing. Crazy thing, but you can see it now, right? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Livia. By the way, if you have any questions at any time, please do feel free to ask. If you have any comments, any remarks, anything that you want to say, you're more than welcome to share them with us. Yeah, so essentially we were talking about very mechanical tasks, such as typewriting and that sort of thing, accounting and mechanics. And as a matter of fact, if we go back and we consider the last 90 or the last 100 years in education, the whole education system has been built around the idea of mass production, of very mechanical stuff. And until the late 80s or early 90s, as a matter of fact, people didn't really need to be that creative. They just had to learn how to read, how to write, how to do basic maths, and people could get along with their lives. Even if you were fairly successful, if you were an administrator, for example, or an accountant, you didn't have to learn some soft skills, but essentially, the whole process was very much focused on mass production and labor, right? But then, when we get to the 90s, things change, right? Things change quite dramatically because that's when, because of the computing power, as a matter of fact, people start needing more creative activities. People start needing to develop skills which were not related to manual labor anymore, right? So the Long Island Institute of Design created an approach to STEM, right? They first called it STEM, which stands for, again, science, technology, engineering, and maths, right? And although it's been around since the 90s, it wasn't until 2007 that it was under the spotlight, because the then Obama administration realized that to provide for the future generations, in order to have enough labor for the future generations, the education approach would have to be changed. Because at school, people were learning how to read, write, and do basic maths, but they weren't learning about creativity, about creating things, about building things, and coming to conclusions and going through critical thinking processes. Everything was very mechanical. So the Obama administration focused very much on ensuring that people had an education that was cross-curricular. It was more interdisciplinary in a variety of ways. So they stopped seeing science as an isolated subject, and they started seeing science as the basis of learning, right? So there was this big lack of professionals in these areas, and they didn't really seem to be interested in doing science. So because of this approach, and because the way this approach was implemented in schools, then people started getting a bit more interested. When we look at the past, we see that most of the jobs, they were very mechanical oriented. But then when we think about the jobs of the future, you will see that professionals, managers, personal service workers, sales, all of those jobs which are more soft skills oriented, they weren't being catered for, right? So creativity is now demanded, right? In the past, it would take you perhaps 2 or 3 hours to do a mathematical operation. Nowadays, people have a hard time, memorizing phone numbers. Is that a bad thing? Not intrinsically, because you do have phones which have, an attached phone book. I mean, if you want to do basic maths, you have your calculating machine embedded in your phone. So this is not essential anymore. And the definition of essential has really changed. And then when we consider how the job market is changing, we see that jobs with skill shortages, they are in the STEM field. This data set is from 2018, but it does show that 75% of all new jobs, they will require STEM skills related, right? And 90% of these jobs, they will need some sort of digital skills. Now, because when we're talking about digital literacy and digital approaches, we tend to think of a very mechanical thing. But as a matter of fact, it is not. Digital technologies, they revolve around creativity. And creativity is not really a very scientific field. It's very... So in the last few years, the STEM approach has been reshaped. It has been changed so as to include this big A, right? And then we include arts. We tend to think of the arts part. The most obvious expression of arts, of course, is this. You walk into a gallery such as, this is the National Gallery in London. So you walk into a gallery, you see beautiful paintings, and that's it. But as a matter of fact, arts, the arts in STEAM is way more than that. It encompasses, for example, kinesthetic expressions such as dance, but it also encompasses the work of, this is Noam Chomsky, a fantastic linguist. It also encompasses different languages and how languages are used so that people can build bridges across communities, right? So you're talking about essentially creativity, languages, dance, drama as well, design, and especially new media. And by new media, I mean dealing with all what is now being called the 4.0 industrial revolution, right? Which is this huge digital revolution and the way we produce content all the time, and also problem solving skills. So we have a whole set that is encompassed in that A, and it's a big thing, right? Did I manage to, I think I talked a lot, Zaida. Did I manage to answer your question?
Actually, yes, thank you very much. And when you made a point of including the A that relates to art, then it made even more sense and it became clearer what STEAM refers to. Teachers, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Paulo. You can write your questions here in the chat and he will answer them.
Yes.
Thank you, Paulo.
Let me get the chat here. Q&A. Okay.
Actually, there are no questions yet.
Okay.
But there will be. I'm sure there will be.
All right. Brilliant. And then in the past couple of years, I think in the last 3 to 4 years, we saw a big buzz in the maker, in education in general, when people started talking about the maker movement, right? So in a nutshell, what is the maker movement? It is a movement that asks us, teachers, to leave the digital room a bit and go back a little bit to getting students to have actual hands-on experiences, right? Because digital technologies, they've been around for a very long time. They've been, I mean, if you've been a teacher in the last 10 years, you've been very much technologically engaged, whether it's through using a platform or using your mobile device to teach a lesson or sending your students homework via Moodle or Google Classroom, whatever tool that you use. And then the maker movement started asking us to go back to the idea of actually building things, getting kids to experience hands-on moments, right? And essentially, it is the integration of the maker movement, the movement of building things into an educational setting. Funnily enough, we see now, especially now during the social distancing period that so many of us have experienced, we see lots of influences of the maker movement in ways that we weren't quite expecting. I don't know how it goes with you, but I had, I think 400,000 of my friends, they started baking during the quarantine, right? And all of a sudden, I started seeing my friends posting pictures on Instagram of fantastic loaves of bread that they started making. And I was like, why are they baking? And this is in many ways an influence of the idea that we should go back to building and touching things rather than just being digitally connected. So it goes a little bit beyond the idea of the do-it-yourself approach that is so popular, for example, in the United States. The idea here is that we should be building, we should be creating new things and solutions to the problems that we have, right? So maker education in that sense, it's a combination of hands-on learning and project-based learning. The beauty of the maker movement is that it matches really perfectly with project-based learning, right? And how does it engage the maker generation? And how does it fit maker education? How does this approach will fit into that? What is the connection between the STEAM approach and maker education? They're not exactly the same thing, but they do focus on three main major, you could say, stems or tenets that are very similar. Both the STEAM approach and the maker education movement, they are student-centered, right? So we get students in the center of a learning experience. If you go back to there is a cycle that was essentially designed by a professor in the 70s, I think, called Kolb. And he proposes what is called the Kolb learning experiential cycle. And his claim is that people learn better and more effectively if they undergo a circle that begins with having a theory. Then students should have the opportunity to experience and hypothesize about this theory, and then actually doing that experience, reflecting upon the results of that experience so as to improve it. This is in many ways like you're trying to teach a child not to touch the hot oven, right? You can tell the child over and over, please don't touch the hot oven. That's a bad idea. That's not going to work. But eventually, the child is not going to learn the concept of hot and cold unless he or she has the experience of touching the hot oven, and that will eventually happen. You can ignore that fact and let the child, burn his or her hand, or you can provide the scaffolding that is necessary for this child to undergo this experience in a controlled fashion so that he or she can experience what code is. So in this student-centered approach, we end up providing students with more memorable experiences, right? And then we are also talking about problem-solving skills, which is, I have my life, I'm going to analyze the problems that need solving to develop skills which will help me later on with more complex issues. If we go back now, for example, to the BNCC or to the Common Core in the United States, both of them, they are very much designed around the idea that we need to help kids solve problems, even though they might be very simple problems right now, such as look at the weather. What do you think the weather is going to be like later in the day? So that later on in life, they can actually solve more complicated and more complex issues, right? And also hands-on and interdisciplinary activities, right? So this is the overlap between both the STEAM and the Maker education. Now, there is a fact also that it's not here, but I'd like to share with you. It's fun. It is really fun. It is really engaging. It's way
Absolutely.
more, yeah, it's way more engaging than getting students to sit and fill in the blanks, because we are always getting them to consider real life situations and what they are going to get out of those experiences, right? So how do we turn the STEAM and Maker education into practice? What are the steps? What should we do for this? First of all, we need to, and something happened in my presentation. Okay.
It's all right. Perhaps if you click further after this one.
Yeah, let me just unshare and share in a bit so that, okay, just a quick second.
It's all right.
The best part about technology and working with technology is the fact that I have this principle that it will essentially go wrong eventually, and usually at the worst possible time.
Well, Murphy's Law, right, Paolo?
Yes, it is very much Murphy's Law.
Murphy's Law at its best.
Yes, it's just, oh, the thing is that my PowerPoint froze. Okay, bear with me for 5 seconds. It is getting there. Okay, I think I got it.
Dear teachers, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and Paolo will be happy to answer them. Right, Paolo?
Oh, yes, please.
We haven't got any questions yet, but I'm sure that we will have some.
Yeah, I really love questions, because then we get to have a bit of interaction. And then I managed to get my screen back on, I hope. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we get STEAM and Maker education in practice? It is way less complex than we think. First of all, working with projects. And projects, they don't need to be incredibly complicated. Some projects, they can be as simple as getting students to observe and experience things around them. Because we tend to take lots of things for granted. For example, observing plants growing around the school and how they evolve throughout the semester. That's a project that can be done with children, and registering that through photographs. Allowing students and affording students opportunities to think, to question, and create. Because if we talk about creativity, but we don't allow for the creation, for creativity to be put into practice, it's not going to happen. Students, they need time and freedom, right? Students, we can't rush things. At my job, I very often get to observe teachers trying to do amazing projects. And sometimes I see that the projects, they don't work as much as they could, just because students are not allowed the time to reflect upon the project and observe the results. So this the steps of reflection and engaging in observation, they are essential. We should be there to give guidance and support, right? Our role changes a little bit. We are not the center of knowledge anymore. And I mean, we haven't been the center of knowledge for quite some time. There is one thing that I usually say whenever I'm talking to teachers: any 5-minute Google search will teach students, will give students more content about whatever aspect of content it is than we could possibly know in a lifetime, because the availability of content is tremendous. Our job then is to provide guidance and support rather than being a walking dictionary, right? Allowing students to have access to different resources, and by different resources, I don't mean high-tech stuff, but sometimes just allowing them to experience things that they go a little bit beyond the classroom, sometimes realia, sometimes just pieces of paper that they can cut out and play with. And lots of schools, they now offer a maker space, which is your case.
It's our case, yes.
Exactly.
You have this beautiful maker space.
It's a fantastic resource, right? The maker space itself doesn't do anything. it's just materials, right? It's just a set of materials that we have there. The makerspace becomes an amazing space for learning when we use it in a fashion that pedagogy comes first. So we consider our lesson, we plan our lesson around problem-solving skills and cognitively challenging projects so that we can actually make good use of a makerspace. Is it essential? No, it is not essential. For example, I'm sure you had this happening, but in São Paulo, we are still in this social distancing moment and schools are still closed. And I see lots of teachers still being able to work with STEAM and Maker education by getting students to work with simpler projects at home and share their discoveries with the groups, right? And then when we change this specifically to the English language teaching classroom, the English language teaching lessons, there are a couple of things that we can do to embrace both STEAM and Maker education. Very simple things, such as incorporating STEAM topics and vocabulary to our practice. And then we focus a little bit on problem solving. So task-based learning and problem-based learning, they are fantastic for this because the language that students develop in the turn taking, in the negotiation skills, that's essential language for learning. And that's also a part of both approaches to teaching. They can play STEAM games, which can be very simple games, such as comparing and contrasting projects. And we can always introduce simple STEAM projects and activities. So there is a very clear overlap between STEAM and CLIO, right? Whereas STEAM is essentially CLIO without the language learning part. Right, so there is a very, you're talking about content and language integrated learning. And here we are talking about content as the core, but there is a very clear overlap between both of them. And when we bring the maker movement, the maker education into ELT, we are also going to include traditional making, building little things, building little projects so that students can build, so that they can build rapport. Things such as, are you teaching the times of the day? Get students to build their own clocks with cardboard and chopsticks. So we also get to investigate learners' interests, passions, talents. So all those little memorable experiences, they do foster learning because they lower students' affective future, right?
So it's beyond learning a language, really, isn't it? Much beyond.
It's much beyond learning just language. It is about building memories so that the language learning process becomes so entrenched into language learning that you can't really detach them, right? There was a question here that the name of the person is not here, but that's the way it goes. We develop projects here, I know, and you have a very nice makerspace. They're very structured and they follow a strict schedule because they are graded at the end of the project. Do you think projects should be graded, or should they be more like practice and creativity opportunities? Well, I think projects, they can be graded, but it is important to qualify what a project entails. Because if you're going to qualify just for let's say that you are getting students to build a small rocket, right? You're not going to grade the ability of that little rocket to fly. You're going to grade the process of making that happen and perhaps a little bit the final product. The process is important as well. But there is one thing that, for example, we should take into consideration. Writing a blog or writing an essay can also be a project. Just to share a little bit of my personal experience, as Zaira mentioned, I'm currently taking a master's degree in professional development. And it is a partially distance learning course. I've taken some modules face-to-face, and some of them I've taken online. And for each module, I have a project, right? And the projects, they range from designing a course for teachers all the way to writing an essay. My last project was actually a very uncreative project of writing a 15,000 word essay. So it depends very much on what the project is, but projects, they can be assessed. You can, in the assessment process, you can award students a mark or a grade for that. And I think projects, they are brilliant when it comes to getting students to build a portfolio and the portfolio to be assessed. Now, the beauty of that is that assessment becomes a very practical tool rather than just tests. We tend to link tests and assessment, but tests, they are one tool for assessment. They're not the same thing. Personally speaking, and I might be losing clients by saying this, I don't like tests. I'm a horrible test taker. All my life, I was an underachiever in tests. And I was an underachiever in tests because I get really nervous about the test. And as I get really nervous about the test, my grades, they tend to be lower than they could be if I were not under so much pressure, right? So this thing of allowing students to be assessed through their portfolios tends to be a bit fairer and more inclusive than just asking students to sit an exam. But going back here to this bridge between ELT and the Maker education, we can always integrate making into existing lessons. So looking at the language and vocabulary that we expect students to develop at certain stages of the course, and trying to identify things that they could build throughout the course. And those things, they can be quite interesting. So for example, let's say that your students are learning language to go shopping. You could get a bunch of students who are usually very smart and tech savvy and get them to design a blog in which they would be sharing reviews of different shops. This is the Maker education on a shoestring in many ways, because there are very few actual materials involved. But this is a very easy way, for example, to implement Maker education into an English language lesson. And essentially, we can always collaborate with other teachers. This idea of having a network, a support network in which we can get to share projects and ideas is essential. Now, just to share a bit of a practical project that, for example, you could do with your students tomorrow, and it is very simple. I don't, do people in Manaus tend to live in flats or houses, or is it the same?
It depends. I think
Is it
it's
50-50?
roughly, yeah, roughly 50-50.
So you would have backyards
But
and
more in houses, I think.
yeah, and of course you do have areas around with perhaps parks or a school garden and that sort of thing. Yeah, excellent. I envy that. Well, in São Paulo we tend to have lots of concrete and perhaps a tree every here and there. I assume, of course, that your garden doesn't look like this. If it does, congratulations.
You have to come to Manaus very, very soon, Paulo. No,
I do. I know that. Zeta, do you live in a house or in a flat?
I live in a house.
Okay. Do you sometimes get animals around the house, like small animals, rodents?
I do, yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Do you know all of them? Have you seen all? Do you get to see them very often, or do you think some of those animals they just come and go and you've never seen them?
I've seen. I saw a snake once.
Oh God!
And it was only once.
Okay.
So we can say that snakes come and go, but I've seen iguanas often, etc. Yeah.
Well, not here in São Paulo, but I lived in Rio for 10 years. And I used to live kind of like close to the woods. And sometimes I would get little monkeys and squirrels coming in and stealing food, right? So, but I was always very curious because I've never seen them. I knew they were there because the food disappeared and they lived by myself. So if I haven't eaten, someone must have, and I prefer to think that it was the squirrels. But then we can actually, by engage students in this sort of discussion and get them to experience the idea of observing those animals without observing, by getting them to build a tunnel that will get students to leave footprints, that will get the animals to leave footprints so that they can analyze the footprints and check what kind of animals live around their houses. So very simple 3-step process: getting a piece of cardboard, putting a bit of ink, and a bait. That bait can be a little bit of food, etc. Just fold the cardboard, leave the cardboard in the woods or in the garden, right? So if you look at picture 3, it's just like a small piece of cardboard that's folded with a bait in it and some paint around it. With, as you can see, there is also some white paper, right? So as the animal comes in to get the food, the animal, when it's leaving, it will leave some footprints on the white piece of paper, and then they will look a little bit like number 5 there, right? So you have those little marks, which they can, for example, measure and then discuss what that is. So that's a very simple project that students, for example, that's the essence of the Maker movement for children. That's an experiment that I borrowed from the Natural History Museum in London. They have a whole section of experiments that kids can do at home that revolve around the Maker movement, in which they build things to explore and observe the world around them. And therefore, they are building not only language skills by doing this in English, but also they are developing awareness of the world around them and problem-solving skills. There are lots of things that they can be done at home quite simply without much complication. I know that parents at this time, they are, I think, overwhelmed, is to say the least. I don't know if you have kids, but I have friends who have kids, and whenever the school sends a project, they run away. It's like, I don't want to do this project. But there are some projects that can be done both in class, but also outside class with very low technology and almost no supplies. Things such as like weather journals, and by getting students to, just by going outside and taking notes of what the weather is like, so that they can explore and they can see a little bit how the weather changes and build a table for that. Building visual journals to see how things progress over time. And that can be, for example, taking photographs of a pet they have every 3 weeks or so, or observing a plant to grow, and by getting them to build a visual journal, they will be able to observe how things change over time. Things such as simple as making ice. That's a very simple thing, but the process of making ice involves a lot of observation, because they have to observe the water and then how the water turns into ice, and then how it melts, and then how eventually how it evaporates. This is a one-day experiment that takes nothing but some water and perhaps, you know, an ice tray or a plastic cup that they will put the water inside. I don't know if you've tried the germs and soap experiment. I tried this with a group of students I had. It's a fantastic one that it was, I think, especially for this moment, it's very effective. That essentially involved getting two Ziploc bags. And in one of the Ziploc bags, I asked students to get a slice of bread before washing their hands, to manipulate it and put it inside the Ziploc, right? And then I asked them to wash their hands, or to wipe their hands with hand sanitizer. I've got plenty of it around here. And after they cleaned their hands, they got another slice of bread. They put it inside the other Ziploc. They sealed the Ziplocs and they put it away. And every week after that, their assignment was to go back to the place where they stored it, to take a photograph and write in one sentence what had happened to the slices of bread. As you may imagine, a week after the bread had been manipulated. The one they manipulated before washing their hands was full of mold, right? Because it was full of bacteria, etc. And then this very simple process allows students to experience what happens when they don't wash their hands. And it is very much based on scientific observation, which is the core of the maker movement, right? And then by doing this, we avoid, for example, kids, people in the future believing that the earth is flat. This sort of scientific approach to teaching, learning is very much part of our responsibility, because we are not just teaching a language, we are teaching how people communicate through a language. It's different than just teaching the verb to be and the present perfect. We are teaching much more. And when we use contexts which are geared towards scientific observation through inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, we are encouraging our students to explore a little bit of the world. I would like to share with you this link, this QR code. By scanning, if you just point your camera, it will open a page with, I think, about 10 or 15 different projects that are very simple to be done with students, both in class, but also outside class. And they are very simple things, such as like getting students to visit virtual art galleries or different museums. There are some fantastic museums students can visit on these virtual field trips that you can do with them, and such as the Natural History Museum, both in New York and London, but also art galleries such as the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And by doing this, you're encouraging them to explore a little bit more of the world, right? As I said before, the idea is that pedagogy should come first. And by embedding this approach to our lessons, it's not just the fireworks and the excitement of building things. It's building things with a purpose that will essentially create new men, new women who are doing new things. Yeah, they are building new things. And I would like to wrap up with one of my all-time favorite quotes by Piaget, which is, the principal goal of education is to create men and women who are capable of doing new things, not just repeating what other generations have done before, right? Because this type of office is not going to happen anymore. So there is the humanistic approach of like, okay, by doing this, we will have better citizens. But there is also the very practical, pragmatical aspect of allowing our students to have an education that is more in line with the future of economies. So when we look at the future of jobs, we are looking at jobs that will require creativity, that will require problem solving skills, right? So to wrap up, I'd like to leave you with this quote. If you have any questions, anything that you want to say, any remarks that you want to make, I'm all yours.
Thank you very much, Paulo. That was fantastic. And
you.
teachers, please, if you have any questions, you can type them up in the Q&A box. It's interesting, Paulo, to note that when you talk about the makerspace movement and the point you made that it can be low tech and high tech also, right? That was very interesting because we do associate, well, I tend to associate the maker movement, the STEAM movement with high tech, but it's not, right? Many times
it's not that it's not, it's rather that it doesn't have to be. I think this is the sort of thing that needs to be adapted to the context. For example, I've seen the Department of Education in Maranhão, for example. They have amazing projects that revolve around the maker movement and project-based learning. I think the education department in Maranhão is really avant-garde when it comes to this sort of thing. I think in Pernambuco as well, up to a certain extent, even in Amazonas as well. We are talking about schools that they are not as privileged as we are in terms of resources. right? And they still manage to make it happen. This is much more about the way lessons are planned and designed rather than just having the tools. So this is, again, it's always the thing that if the lesson is well designed, if the course is well designed, the resources, they're going to be just the support, right? They're going to give support to good teaching. There is no material that's going to replace good teaching, right? So it's good teaching after all.
Thank you, Paulo. Of course, yes, you've said it all. There's a very interesting question here, which is the challenge of having maker activities, projects, and being able to manage the syllabus within the schedule that you have. So let me see if there's a question here. But pragmatically speaking, the ideal world, our syllabus would be one, less loaded with content to allow for more practical activities.
Yeah.
What's your view on that? Do you have any hints to give?
Junior, I think ideally, of course, the syllabus would be really well connected with projects. But I like it depends very much on the school administration and how much you can negotiate. But if you have the course learning outcomes very clear, you can incorporate the projects and the syllabus that you have. So rather than doing, for example, one project every lesson, for example, you can have one project that is ongoing throughout the entire semester and that students do bit by bit. So for example, one project that you could develop with your students that it's a bit high tech, but it doesn't have to be complicated. It's a community podcast that students could develop and they could record themselves, and they do it at their own time. You just monitor the progress of the podcast recording, or a news broadcast that, or delivering presentations, or gathering data. So for example, this is a classical STEAM project, which is building infographics and compiling data. This is a very much workplace situation that managers have to do. It's fine, and it's just talk to them. It's, I think, open communication, having this open channel tends to work very well.
Thank you, Paulo. We've got 3 minutes. It's 5:57. There's a.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been an immense pleasure talking to you and to all the teachers. And I really hope to see you all in person again.